In June 1915, 18-year-old Emily Whitwell was charged at the police court for absconding from the York Penitentiary Sheltering Home with clothing and boots. She was described by the Ladies' Committee, who were responsible for interviewing and admitting girls to the home, as very untruthful. They noted that she had run away more than once and had been brought back to the home by police after being found sleeping out. When the magistrate offered her the option between prison or the penitentiary, Whitwell declared, "I don't want to go back to the home. I don't wish to go into any more homes." The York Penitentiary Society, a charitable female reformatory in York, was formed in 1822 with the aim of addressing the perceived culture of immorality in the city by rescuing the fallen from a life of sin. In 1845, the Society opened a long-term home known as the Refuge to provide asylum for such women as, having followed vicious courses, are desirous of obtaining the means of reformation. The Society didn't intend to reform hardened streetwalkers with lengthy criminal records, but young women who had not been on the streets long enough to be intractable from their habits. The Society aimed to transform these fallen women in the city through institutionalization, domestic training, and moral and religious instruction. This combination, described in the 1845 annual report as a system of constant labour, discipline, and pious instruction, aimed at producing young women who could be productive and morally non-threatening, and so return to society and class-appropriate feminine duties, largely domestic service. The records of the Penitentiary Society are most complete over the years 1845 to 1919, the life of the Refuge at Bishop Hill. In 1919, the Society actually moved to new premises where it continued to house rescue cases until 1939, when it was then certified to operate as an approved school, before finally closing its doors in 1950. The public records of the Society recount the success stories of the penitentiary regime, girls who were rescued and, after receiving 2 years of moral, religious and educational training, returned fully repentant to their friends and family, or found a position in service. The voice of these reformed young women are largely absent from such accounts. The documents that were not intended for public consumption are rather different in tone. They provide a more revealing picture, certainly of the day-to-day running of the home, and include admission notes for the young women who applied to the Refuge. Yet, even here, between the applicant telling her story, the Society recording it, and the historian recounting it, there is little space for the voice of the young female inmates, as they were referred to be heard. Once admitted to the home, the voices of these young women are even harder to discern, with only fleeting glimpses into their perceptions of the Refuge. And it's these glimpses that form the basis of this paper. Some young women wrote letters, maintained contact with the matron after they'd left the institution, or returned to the Refuge for visits, while others again engaged in acts of disobedience, caused trouble, or ran away from the home. These young, primarily working-class women used various methods to convey their own feelings and views, and it's through a close reading of the penitentiary records that this paper will examine how these girls and young women resisted, confronted, accepted, and acknowledged attempts to define and regulate their behaviour, both within and outside of the home. In 1856, the local Yorkshire Gazette noted that there are few places in the country where an institution like the female penitentiary were more urgently required. And although the Refuge was just one of a number of institutions established in the city to reform fallen women across this period, it was the only long-term home and the only one with surviving detailed evidence. The Refuge could house up to 30 inmates, as they were referred to, and as a charitable institution, it relied on voluntary subscriptions and support from wealthy local donors, although some of the expenses were met by the laundry work undertaken by the young female residents. The Refuge was run by the Penitentiary Society, who appointed a president, treasurer, secretary and 2 committees, the Gentlemen's and Ladies' Committee. A number of senior penitentiary figures were prominent in local government and also had connections with other local and national rescue charities. Their reach, therefore, extended into various organisations across the city and across the country, many of which took an explicit interest in the reformation and policing of young women. The Gentlemen's and Ladies' Committees were in charge of managing the Refuge, with the gentlemen in control of the financial and administrative aspects, and the ladies tasked with overseeing the matron and the home's day-to-day running, as well as being responsible for the moral and religious instruction of the young female inmates. The ladies interviewed all applicants to the Refuge, but could not formally admit women without the express consent of the Gentlemen's Committee, and there were gendered tensions over the governance of the Refuge and the responses of the society to the fallen women in their care. A matron and her assistant were required to live in the house, and both were responsible for keeping an account of the behaviour of the young women resident in the home and reporting on this conduct to the Ladies' Committee. Frances Finnegan and Emma Hughes have used the records of the York Penitentiary, particularly to explore the problem of poverty and prostitution in the city. Finnegan in particular, though, engages with these records far too uncritically, often exaggerating the deviant status of women working as prostitutes in her presentation of the evidence, and accepting the Penitentiary Society's own definitions of fallen women. Though primarily intended as a home for the fallen, for women working as prostitutes, this was an elastic category, and many of those admitted to the Refuge were not in fact prostitutes or sexually promiscuous. The admission notes detail that one young woman, Sarah Jane Durston, denied having fallen but admitted having been troublesome at home. She was admitted in 1887 after promising to try and control her temper and language and to conform to the rules. Some working-class parents brought their daughters to the Refuge as a way of asserting their authority over girls and their economic and sexual behaviour, turning to the penitentiary when girls stayed out late, participated in popular leisure, or had inappropriate boyfriends. Martha Barker was sent to the Refuge aged 17 by her father after he suspected she was beginning to live an immoral life due to the fact she was keeping late hours. 15-year-old Lillian Gray was sent to the penitentiary from a temporary sheltering home in April of 1917. Her transgressions were: she won't keep her places, stops out at night, swears, steals, and won't work. And the society often grouped prostitutes, promiscuous young women, those who engaged in premarital sex, and even young women who simply enjoyed the commercial leisure amusements offered by the city, all together as fallen women, unfortunates, or bad girls. Young female inmates were required to submit voluntarily to life in the home, and while the society lacked the statutory power to detain young women against their will, once admitted, it was difficult to leave. Those admitted were required to confess their fall and sign a declaration stating, "I am wishful to abandon my sinful life and by God's grace to lead a better." The Ladies' Committee would only admit hopeful women to the Refuge, which in practice meant mostly young women who seemed, or were certainly seen as, most amenable to moral training. Women over a certain age were deemed to be beyond reclamation, more difficult to mould, with more to unlearn. The Ladies' Committee also tried to avoid admitting any girls that they felt likely to cause trouble or who they judged might have a disruptive impact on those girls already in the home. Although even hopeful cases could prove disappointing. In 1873, the ladies were particularly saddened by the case of Sarah Agar, an inmate whom they had helped to find a very respectable place in service, but once in her situation proved so badly behaved that she was sent away. The daily routine in the home was monotonous and the laundry work hard. While not a formal penal institution, the Refuge certainly used coercive methods more commonly found in the prison and associated with punishment. defined periods of confinement, set timetables, physical punishments, and compulsory labour, which were combined with what Alana Barton has referred to as familial forms of regulation, domestic training, religious instruction, supervision, and guidance, normally administered in the family home. Though not formally incarcerated, young inmates' liberty was restricted, and the girls were forced to wear penitentiary dresses, were referred to as inmates, and constantly supervised. The matron had the power to punish them as she saw fit. A conduct rules poster was displayed in all the rooms in the refuge, instructing the inmates that lying, swearing, dishonesty, repeated disobedience, and gross misbehaviour shall be punished by the committee with expulsion. Inmates were not generally allowed out of the home unless it was to attend a public church service with the matron. Visitors were strongly discouraged, and all letters, both in and out, were inspected. Mr. Richardson, a member of the Gentlemen's Committee, made it known at the annual meeting in 1874 that he felt the young women were kept too much like the inmates of a prison or a nunnery, and in March of 1900, a lover of truth and justice wrote an anonymous letter to the members, to one member of the Penitentiary Committee. Your committee reports everything very bright and say nothing of a dark side, and a dark side I feel sure there is by so many of the inmates running away. The main front of the refuge looked over a secluded garden which helped to isolate its occupants from the outside world and formed a physical boundary between the respectable women outside and the fallen women within. The high wall around the garden served to emphasise this boundary, and in 1905, after a number of breakouts, the matron was instructed, on the advice of the chief constable, to have the walls topped with broken glass. The committee later discussed adding spikes after a series of additional escape attempts. The young female inmates may have been isolated from the rest of the urban population, but they also served as a warning to others of behavioural transgressions. Cissy Colley told the York Oral History Project how the penitentiary building and all that it represented was used as a threat to control her behaviour, demonstrating how the moral reach of the refuge extended far beyond the institution's own walls. There was a place on Bishop Hill called the penitentiary where fallen girls would have to be put. They shoved you in there. And if I'd been bad, my grandma that lived in Victor Street used to take me by the hand and say, "That's going to happen to you, my lass, if anything happens to you." The annual reports published by the Society were distributed to subscribers, and along with records of the annual meeting were also reproduced in the local press and used as a means to encourage donations, recounting success stories and stressing the necessity of the Society's work with the fallen women of the city. In supporting such an institution, the public were helping to benefit not the inmates alone, but society at large. That there were some success stories is demonstrated by letters from some of the young women who maintained contact with the matron after they had left the institution, some of the young women recalling their time in the home fondly, and often returning for visits at Christmas and other holidays. The Society used these accounts to insist that the refuge produced good results, providing inmates persevered with the regime. The Society noted in their 1872 report that AJ, a very unpromising case when received, was sent to a very good situation where she remained some years. She is now most comfortably married. And the 1907 report told subscribers how the girls who have gone into service write constantly and gratefully to the matron, testifying to the blessings received through the wholesome influence exercised by her. In 1909, the Society reported of the letters received by Miss Bennington, the then matron, from girls in service, some may raise a smile, as that in which one girl tells of her happiness in becoming engaged to her boy, and a good boy too. The grammatical error clearly highlighted there for readers. Although the reports were clearly put together to show the institution in the best possible light, disappointment with the results was apparent and some tensions and quarrels were hinted at. 1858 appeared to be a particularly difficult year, with the Society reporting that 10 of the inmates have been dismissed for insubordinate conduct during the past year. The trials and difficulties of the institution have been of unusual recurrence. In 1902, the committee reported that the past year had been an anxious one for all concerned with the work of the institution, following a wave of unrest amongst the young female inmates. This unrest was blamed on one or two ringleaders whose influence was said to have spread through the house and culminated in the escape of several of the inmates. The girls were immediately brought back, but soon afterwards almost all the girls in the home got out of hand. The Ladies' Committee minute books provide some additional insight into this unrest, describing trouble long-standing between the matron and the inmates, and noting that while the matron has many good points, she seems to have lost all control over the girls. The documents that were not intended for public consumption, such as the Ladies' Committee minute books, along with visitors' books, committee reports and admission notes, do give further insight into daily life in the institution, the circumstances that led to a young woman's fall, and the numerous ways the Penitentiary Society looked to reform the young women in their care. They also offer further details of the various responses to these attempts by the young women who passed through the refuge, and the relationships between the young female inmates, the matron, and other penitentiary staff. In 1904, the Ladies' Committee felt that they had to discipline Assistant Matron Miss Holt for lowering herself to the level of one girl who spoke to her with great rudeness, and therefore provoking the girl Alice Ellis to lose control. These records can provide a reflection of the voice of those young women interviewed or admitted to the home. The admission notes feature assertions of girls and young women, often in a state of desperate material and emotional distress, and of course filtered through the questions and the pens of the Ladies' Committee. How these young working class women interacted with the middle class Ladies' Committee members, and how they in turn interpreted young women's sexual agency must of course be considered. As Philippa Levine found in her examination of 19th and early 20th century texts on prostitution, there is a constant allusion in the admission notes to the external reasons for prostitution and a woman's fall, most commonly parental neglect, insanitary and overcrowded housing conditions, and seduction. At the same time, the young women were also found to demonstrate the very worst characteristics, such as laziness, bad character, and lust, and blamed for their own immorality. The young women themselves often used passive language when describing their feelings about relationships and the fall that brought them to the penitentiary. There's very little admission of desire. One notable exception is Mary Jane Barnett, who told the Ladies' Committee that she was feeling quite reckless and very deliberately went wrong with a young man she had known for some time. Some of the young women who were interviewed for admittance explicitly challenged the committee's attempts to define their behaviour. Annie Wainwright was interviewed by the Ladies' Committee in November of 1899, but refused to stay in the refuge. She admitted to her fall with one young man, but rejected the claim that this was unacceptable or immoral behaviour on her part. Charlotte Ann Metcalfe, aged 20, was brought to the refuge by a police constable, and while she admitted to having gone with men and being a bad girl, she, and I quote, emphatically denied having been guilty of immorality at any time. 15-year-old Ellen Dinsdale, whose father was angry with her for going to music halls and sent her to the home, also denied having fallen, although admitted to associating with bad girls. These distinctions in behaviour could matter a great deal to the young women interviewed, and Eliza Spinks, who was 14 when interviewed for admittance in 1889, was described as being obstinate in her refusal to accept that she had fallen. Hester C., a 20-year-old domestic servant admitted to the penitentiary shelter in 1914 after attending the theatre with a young army officer, argued with the Ladies' Committee that the blame for her fall should be shared with the young soldier she was found with. They have a fascinating way within these officers, and as soon as they have got all they can out of a girl, they have done with you and that's the end of it. They pick you up in the street. They won't speak to you in town in the daytime, but when they get you in the dark, they are quite all right. And of course, even a young woman's entry to the refuge did not mean that she acknowledged the society's definition of her behaviour. Some young women refused to accept the moral authority of the refuge and protested through their admission interviews, in letters and before the magistrates. Ethel Welton, brought before the Ladies' Committee in 1901 and described by the ladies as very wild and untruthful, protested that she had been brought to the refuge against her will and would not stay. The ladies admitted her on probation. In 1908, the Ladies' Committee reported that one former inmate, Rose Curtis, had written a very impudent letter to Miss Bennington, the matron. Emily Whitwell, who was charged at the police court for absconding from the penitentiary, told the magistrate, "I don't want to go back to the home. I don't wish to go into any more homes," and instead was sent to prison. And Annie Rhodes similarly preferred the option of the workhouse after refusing to stay at the refuge. Some girls left a mark in the records in other ways, protesting by running away from the home or causing trouble. They were dismissed from the refuge for behaving badly, they stole, they swore, they refused to work, and others plotted together to plan escape attempts. Susie Bell was described as a thoroughly naughty girl who was proud of being so, and Annie Cronin was punished for dancing in her bedroom after being forbidden to do so. In 1875, all of the inmates refused to work in the laundry, something which the Ladies' Committee then blamed on one ringleader, Fanny Owens, who was subsequently confined to the probationary ward for a month before being sent to another home. Another unnamed girl fled out of the committee room window, smashed the skylight, and escaped. She was returned to the home by the police, but just a few days later took a square out of the ward window and went through it. In her study of Waverley Park Home for mentally deficient girls, Mary Claire Martin asks us to reconsider acts of misbehaviour within institutions, highlighting the hazards of overplaying the phenomenon of resistance by relying on a few striking examples, and noting that disobedience could make the environment far less pleasant for the other inmates. The penitentiary records do hint at some instances of violence between the young female inmates, as well as from some girls towards the matron and other staff, which could certainly have affected all residing in the home. One former inmate wrote to the matron to apologise for her behaviour while in the refuge. "I am very sorry I caused you so much trouble and anxiety." Other inmates reported the misbehaviour of other girls. Kate Wilburn had been talking openly to others about running away from the refuge, but another girl informed Miss Bennington, the matron, and after a severe talking to, Wilburn promised to say no more. However, inmates also frequently banded together to break the rules or to plot escapes. Alice Pearson, Mary Cherry, and Florence Dinsdale used a ladder left by a workman to scale the high garden wall, escaping because they had heard about a dance being held at the barracks and they wanted to attend. Annie Cronin, just 3 months after being punished for dancing in her bedroom, conspired with another girl to steal some clothes and run away. In 1884, Ethel Pollard and Mary Hinson got hold of a front door key, let themselves out, and were not heard from again. These associations could perhaps be interpreted as relationships of convenience, banding together in the face of difficult, monotonous, and an often punishing regime, but also suggest important and lasting alliances and even friendships formed between the inmates of the refuge. When Emily Giles left the home at the end of her 2 years, the other inmates voluntarily contributed 6pence each towards her railway fare and urged her to keep in touch. In May 1893, the Ladies' Committee reported that some men from Skeldergate have been getting on the wall and talking to the girls in the garden. It has been going on for some time, but has only just been discovered, suggesting that inmates managed to keep these visits a secret from the matron and the committee over a number of months. This paper has used the records of the York Penitentiary Society to offer an insight into how the young working-class women interviewed and admitted to the refuge used various methods to convey their own feelings and views about the home and about their own behaviour both within and outside it. In the absence of accounts from the young women themselves, we must read the official records carefully, both those designed to encourage financial assistance and promote the good work of the society, and the committee minutes, visiting books and mission notes, which reveal far more about the daily routine, tensions and friendships present in the refuge. In doing so, it's possible to draw out the various and multiple ways the young female inmates challenged, confronted, resisted, accepted and acknowledged attempts to define, reform and regulate their behaviour both inside the home as well as outside of it. Thank you very much for listening.